everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar hosted by Digital Twin Consortium. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Philip Bain. Philip Bain is responsible for managing all day-to-day activities at Smart Cities Council. He also focuses on developing the Council's strategic vision, especially its work on using data to improve community well-being and using data to reduce suffering through the Council's Compassionate Cities program. Philip is an expert in applying technology to achieve sustainability. He has been a pioneer in research informatics for sustainability, managing multiple resource streams via integrated data management. And without further ado, Philip?
Great. Thank you, Kayla. Good morning, everybody. It's a gorgeous day here in Virginia. So we have a lot of slides, about 50 so, and as you all know, if I tried to talk to each slide, you'd get very bored and we wouldn't get through this. So I'm going to skip through some of the slides, but they're there and they will be shared. I also want to make the point that much of what I'm talking about is sort of in process or in thinking. I think we are in a very exciting stage when it comes to helping the local public sector, cities and states deal with climate change, systematic issues of poverty and homelessness, but also episodic things like crime and hurricanes and stuff like that. And it's really a fascinating time. So there's a lot of thinking is still in process. And if anybody tells you they figured it all out, they haven't. And so I haven't figured it all out. And what I'm basically doing is sharing my thinking with you about how digital twins can be used by cities. As a part of that, I do want to outline that we have a workshop program next year where essentially we're working with cities that are in the process of procuring digital twin technology and want to get expert advice. We're going to start in Arizona in January, go to Florida in February, and then later in April, we're going to be in Texas at Austin. So if you're interested in participating, please let us know. Now, cities really need your help. I'm going to go through these next few slides. These are all things that you're familiar with. I do think it's important to understand that we're going to continue to build on a massive scale throughout the world. And that also we're dealing with a much different ecosystem than we were 20, 30, 50 years ago. I think you all are familiar with this. I mean, the Hurricane Ian recently in Florida, we actually had to delay our Orlando workshop because of that hurricane, tells you about the impact. And the impacts are not only direct, they're also indirect. Orlando had in-migration of over 500,000 people a year from hurricanes, and then about 180,000 stay in Orlando, which leads to continual growth in that region. So there's a lot of migration because of these issues. But this is where I want to stop for a second and talk about really what you're facing when the problems you're facing when you talk about what can digital twins do. When you go and deal with the built environment, mobility, social systems, you're really dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of years of poor planning. And we worked with Nashville for over a year because it had 200-year floods in 1 year. And the real problem wasn't the flooding so much. It was the fact that there had been a tremendous amount of infill, placement of vulnerable populations in places of high risk. And it was these kinds of planning activities that really led to what was a risk or a hazard becoming a disaster. And this is what's happening throughout the world. You know yourself from what happened with Hurricane Ian in Florida, that those communities that built to the current building codes were less at risk than those that hadn't been able to. And it's things like that where we've been planning for decades, if not hundreds of years, that have put us in the situation where we're not able to deal with many of the disasters we're facing. And that's what you deal with when you're talking about data, instrumentation, analytics, simulation, and visualization. You're dealing with a set infrastructure or parameters that you have no control over that are actually the result of, and you just have to say it, poor planning. So just as an example, and I think you're all familiar with this, from cyber attacks to wildfire, rain, and wind, you can take a certain situation and you can make it a lot worse because of what's already on the ground. And so just as an example with rain, we have more rain, especially those of us in the Southeast and Northeast are going to be looking at more rain. But the problem we have is infill and building on floodplains. So a big issue in both Houston and New Orleans in the recent hurricanes was that the natural systems weren't able to handle the flooding. And you're familiar with this, and you have to take it into account when you talk about digital twins. And I do have what I call sort of a money slide towards the end, which is where I think the work has to go. So what's a smart city? For those of you that are engineers, technical people, there are more standards than you would ever want. When we started this work in 2012, maybe 3 of these standards existed. But today, as you can see, we have easily 30 on the page and easily 30 more not on the page that deal with everything from process to technical to strategic standards. So we're not missing standards. We're also not missing programs. UN Sustainable Development Goals give us policy objectives that tell us what we should be doing with climate change, cities, organizations, social structure. So again, we're not missing standards, we're not missing policies and programs. Those aren't the issues, which they were about 10 years ago. What we are missing is a sense of urgency. Our definition in 2012 was that we're using digital technology to improve what we call the triple bottom line standard of livability, workability, and sustainability. We've totally changed our definition today to extend it beyond technology to also include data and innovation. But we've really made a significant change in that we've gotten rid of the word improve and substituted it with accelerate. The problem you're having today is that we're not moving fast enough to solve the problems. And so in the United States alone, it's from concept to implementation as much as 4 years before you get a project off the ground. And the big problem we have in the United States and the Western world is death by pilot. McKinsey talks about, they did a study on pilots, and most cities love pilots because they're either not paying for them or they use somebody else's budget. They get a big PR release, but they don't solve the problem. And then they have to go through a whole second phase procurement. And I've worked with a number of cities of trying to get out of this pilot mentality into what can we do to accelerate the benefits. Also, another issue when you're dealing with cities, and cities themselves do it, is understanding that smart innovation, technology, and data is not the same thing as sustainable and resilient. There's a tremendous confluence of terms. People really don't understand that resiliency is significantly different than sustainability. And I'll mention now what I've really been spending a lot of time thinking about is a concept called anti-fragility from Nissam Taleb's most recent book, which goes way beyond resiliency and again is a whole different concept around outcomes. So to ground ourselves somewhat in the technology and then explain how cities see it, we're all familiar with where we started. I spent about 5 years in the smart grid. I spent about another 5 years working on semantic data projects. And then I came into the council and started working on IoT, data sharing, and now digital twins, all about digital transformation. As you all know, we started with simply sensors, that is passive reading of ambient data that was collected. Sensors collect. The big change in the last 10 years has been the price of these sensors have come down, and we've added switches and actuators. So now what we're doing, and we did a program with Nashville on this, which I mentioned, where DHS gave a whole session on the difference in the cost of sensors. So of course, if we bring down the cost of sensors, that means we can create much greater sensor arrays and collect more data. And this is a significant change in the last 10 years. And it's significant for digital twins because you have real-time biodirectionality. And that's really important in the end for what digital twins are trying to do in terms of creating not only a measurement and data collection, but also the ability to act. We're all familiar with the initial first descriptions of smart cities. You've probably seen as many graphics around smart streetlights as I have, streetlights telling us what's going on the road. The big difference now, 10 years in, is that everything is giving us data. Now, there are those that will tell you that we're going to have AVs within 5 years. I'm one of those people who believe it's going to take closer to 20 years. But the fact of the matter is we still have tremendous amounts of data now that is being produced by our infrastructure. Many of you in the digital twin space, and I'll talk about this later, come from the built environment. Not as much from transportation, but the built environment, both for buildings and utilities. And so, we're very familiar with buildings telling us their conditions. That is, what's going on within the building, building automation, and such. The big difference in the last 10 years, and I'm really going to focus on this, is really what's happening now is what's going on between the buildings. And I'll give you an example. We spent a lot of time working with Orange County, Florida. They have 1,300 buildings, and I'll give you a little vignette shortly. They also have 75 million visitors a year. So for them, what was important was not necessarily what was happening in each building. They have the third largest conference center in the world, but what was happening between the buildings. Where were people moving? How were they moving? How were they using space? What was their reaction to that space? That's what Orange County is interested in, not just what's happening within the building, but what's happening between all the buildings and what happens from the airport all the way to Disney or any other place that they may travel. So in 2012, we spent a lot of time talking about command and control. And there's some societies still in the world that's their primary focus for using IoT, AI, simulation, and visualization. It's about command and control. IBM started this process over 12 years ago. IBM was actually our first member back in 2012. So a lot of what happens today, and I actually have a problem with this, is that many solution providers see digital twins as just another form of command and control. And the problem you have is that when cities in the West, that's Europe, Australia, and the United States or Canada, and a solution provider comes to them with the same mentality, which is that we can do command and control, they're really not resonating with the city. That scares the heck out of a city. Now, there are some societies, obviously, where surveillance technologies, command and control are really important, but not in this society and not if you want to have sales in this in the United States. So this is actually what cities are looking for: integrated best of breed. This actually is the town of Cary. It's smart and connected community ecosystem for flood and water control. It won several awards. And if you'll notice the difference between the IBM command and control and this, that in this, there's 7 different solution providers, all the way from Microsoft to Dell Boomi to SAS, who we know really well, to Salesforce. And all of them, the big key was integrating the different applications with multiple data sets to provide an integrated best of breed solution. Now, an area where they still really didn't take the next step, which I think they would do now, is with visualization. Okay, so we still have dashboards that are pretty much reporting of data dashboards, just done in a different type of format. And the next step with anything like this would be simulation and visualization. But just to compare those two, this is the one where this is what US cities, European cities, Australian cities are looking for, and that is combining best of breed. So data centralization and federation leads to greater analysis and decision making and is important for digital twins functionality. Now, I think there can be a whole debate between centralization and federation. They're totally 2 different things. Centralization is a data lake. Federation would be more in line with the previous architecture I showed you. And when you're dealing with cities, and we'll talk about this somewhat a little bit later, you really have to look at data sharing or federation as the primary road in which you drive in on to get them to share data and to create analytics, visualization, simulation. But really the big change is treating data as a citywide asset. And I think that's one of the advantages of digital twin solution providers. They actually see the whole ecosystem as providing data, except for one glaring omission, which I'll talk about in a second. But this is the most precious resource the city has. People come to me almost every week talking about how they monetize city data, and I think they're actually missing the mark. I think this is more about how you can use the data for traditional digital twin benefits such as optimization, prioritization. That's still where we are in terms of fully understanding the features of digital twins. So we still see cities as having sensor networks. I mean, that's primarily what most of the companies that I deal with, solution providers, they look at existing sensors. How can they add new sensors, be they smartphones or otherwise? This is the view of a city in 2012, and frankly, it's still the view in 2022. This is what I call the money slide. This is what's missing in digital twins, and that is, how do you take into account what's happening in between the buildings? Sentiment analysis, emotional analysis. We've done a tremendous amount of work at the council on the concept of well-being. How can you measure the way people are using a community in terms of their traffic patterns? This was really important during COVID, both pre and during and after COVID. Were people going to the same places like movie theaters as they were before or not? And then you really get into the issues of data governance and privacy. And this is really where I think the digital twin market needs to go. It needs to look at the how do you include people in the system of systems thinking? How do you include data about people without violating their privacy and about implementing best practice data governance? So many of you are probably familiar with Toronto sidewalks, with Sidewalk Labs, the Toronto waterfront, failure completely because of lacking data governance. Probably some of you have heard about the San Diego surveillance project, which again did not have data governance. We're working with the city of Scottsdale right now, and they have a world-class best practice data governance policy that other cities are actually looking at. And that partly came about because they learned what other cities had done wrong. And this is even before they start implementing ITS, intelligent transportation systems, CCTV, and then we're working with them about how do you scale innovation districts. So this is really, I think, where if I was a solution provider in the space, I would be looking at how can I incorporate data about people in a ethical manner with best practice data governance so as to meet the needs of the city. So just as a summary, and you'll see this when you get the slides. I mean, in some ways, things haven't changed. We're still talking about the Internet of Things. The big difference is that for me, we had awful dashboards in 2012, and to some extent, we still have awful dashboards. Visualization helps, but I still haven't seen really what the full potential of the technology. Now, it's really interesting when you're dealing with cities. I think this is cut off, but this is a 2022 Gartner hypercycle about technology, emerging technologies. And you'll notice that digital twin of the customer is at the early innovation trigger with a 5 to 10 year adoption. And that has to be across the board, all customers in all sectors, because clearly, if you've dealt with cities, you know that it's going to take more than 5 or 10 years to get cities to adopt digital twins. And that's a big piece of what I'm talking about here, is how do you bring cities on board in a way that they're comfortable with? You can't be talking about command and control. You have to be talking about partnerships and how you integrate multiple applications with multiple data sets. So it's really a different approach. But the good thing about it is that there's a recognition that we're at the early stages. Now, with that said, this is the way a city sees a digital twin. In the last 3 years that I've been working in the digital twin space, I have had probably 10 companies tell me that they've had digital twins for 20 years. I'm not going to name the companies, but most of them come from the asset management, and most of them are coming from the utility space. And what happens is they take this sort of infrastructure-centric approach on assets, and they try to extend it into all the other use cases. Now, this is not uncommon if a solution provider is in the BIM space, building automation, building information, they're going to say that they're a digital twin company. If they're in the GIS space, they're going to say they're a digital twin company. But if I'm a city, what happens is I have all of these different solution providers coming at me. Probably the only place that I have found that people don't call themselves a digital twin company is in the sensor instrumentation space, where they're dealing with hardware. I've had data management companies come to me. I've had communication companies come. And then I've had a number of startups that are working in the extended reality visualization space. I think metaverse is a total misnomer for this, but people use it. It's not what digital twins is about. But again, cities don't know that. So the reason I'm showing you this slide is just to understand the city perception. Is they have everybody telling them that they can provide them with a digital twin, and sometimes it's people who have been doing IoT and asset analysis and optimization for 20 years, and then sometimes it's a startup who says that they're in the visualization or extended reality space. And what happens is cities need help, and that's where we come in at the council. And that's where every solution provider I deal with could improve its messaging, its product development, and its go-to-market strategy. So I do want to say there are some successes. The Orlando Economic Partnership and Unity, which is a digital solution, a twin solution provider, they just launched an economic digital twin. We were going to showcase it in our workshop, but then we got, as I said, rescheduled. But this is probably what I see as the number one use case at the city, county, and state level, and that's economic development. So if you're working in the digital twin space, you should really take a look at how you could help cities and counties with economic development. I've had several other regions come to me and say, we really want to do what Orlando is doing with Unity, because they can see an ROI on this. As opposed to some of the other use cases. But the other thing I want to point out, and tremendous kudos should go to Raimundo Rudolfo, who's the Chief Innovation Officer for Coral Gables. He actually has created internally their own digital twin. Now he's using Esri's ArcGIS as the foundation, and yet he's been able to cobble, and cobble may not do it justice, to be perfectly honest. It's pretty impressive. And if you have an opportunity, you should go onto their website, look at their digital twin, and even reach out to Raimundo and talk to him about a demo, because he was going to do that at our Orlando workshop, and we'll do it, in fact, in February. But what it shows is that cities are capable of bringing together multiple applications to create the first instances of digital twins. And this is really encouraging. So on one hand, you can say, based on the Gartner model, that it may be 10 years or more before cities adopt. On the other hand, you can say cities already have the constituent applications, that's BIM, ITS, Intelligence Transportation Systems, GIS, from which they can start integrating to create a digital twin. And that's really encouraging. But I think you have to look at what your use cases are. Are they asset management, or are they maybe economic development, or dealing with, as Orange County wants you to deal with, the 75 million visitors that go through that county every year? So I want to give you a slightly different perspective, and this really is sort of the substance behind my money slide, which is that if you want to be successful with cities, you cannot lead with technology. You have to lead with an understanding of the city's needs. You also have to have partnerships. Going back to the Carey slide, where you had 7 different solution providers from Microsoft all the way to Salesforce, that's what cities are looking for. And then you have to be transparent about data governance, data privacy, and how you're using the data. Many of you have seen the Nova special on predictive crime, and the fact that cities do not want black box algorithms. So the problems that cities face are lack of capacity, stakeholder engagement, slow procurement, and financing. And when you see the slides, you can focus on this. And then many of you have the reality of city siloed operations. I know we're running short on time, but you'll see the slide about Virginia did a survey. Only 20% of the cities shared any kind of data. I could tell you a story where I was in the room with Orange County. I had 60 people, 1,300 buildings. They wanted to procure automated building solutions, but they had 4 different agencies, and people from each different agency had never met people in the other agencies. And so when you're dealing with cities, it's not about technology, it's about dealing with the people. So I have some answers here. I think many solution providers could have more accessible and frictionless applications. I think if you look at what Google or AWS or Microsoft Azure, even Cisco does with their education systems and how they bring people onto their systems, I think more digital twin solution providers could be doing that. I think you could also partner with hyperscalers and cooperatives to get in front of cities. And last but not least, consider how you're going to finance. Some of our partners have huge financing arms for these solutions, and that's how they get the business. We're working with Orlando to identify use cases, and anybody who comes to our Orlando workshop will have an opportunity to look at these use cases and help Orlando, because they're going to be procuring a digital twin next year. Again, this is my money slide, where I'm going to end and say, you've really, in your data gathering, in putting together your digital twin, you need to look at some of these yet to be materialized sources of data. So with that, do we have any questions, Kayla?
Yes, we do. So the first question, you say that data sharing is one of the biggest obstacles to adoption of digital twins. What other technical obstacles do cities have with implementing digital twins?
Great, good question. So the first thing you have to understand with cities is their lack of capacity. They do not understand all the aspects of what it takes to have a smart, resilient city. Many of them forget that the foundations of a smart city are energy, communications, and data. And what I've learned in some of my work with cities is the communications infrastructure is lacking. So just because they have broadband does not necessarily mean they have the ability to reach into a building and relay in real time without latency the necessary data to do the analysis. So one of the things you really should have as part of your partnership team is a strong communications provider. Any other questions?
Yes. Sorry. Can you share the use cases that Orlando is collecting with us?
Yes. For those of you that participate in the Orlando workshop, we have an online planning tool called Activator, where we actually put in all the use cases and then analyze them with the city, trying to map them to solutions. So just come to the Orlando workshop. And that's true of any of our workshops. We'll have use cases. And what we're trying to do is collect enough use cases so at the end of our roadshow, we can share them with cities and show them where they should start in prioritizing their digital twin applications.
We do have a question about the workshops.
Sure.
How may one find further information about the digital twin workshops scheduled next year?
So they're on our website in the calendar under Engage. And if you go there, you'll see not only the 3 planned digital twin workshops, we have 2 more. We also have another 10 workshops on what we call connected communities. Remember, I talked about communications being sort of something that people don't talk about that's necessary for digital twin implementation. And then we also have another 7 workshops on what we call sustainable innovation, which is around the technology piece of energy efficiency, renewables, demand response, and how those fit into a smart city. So if you go to our website, you'll find all of that information.
Wonderful. We'll add that website as part of the attachments after the webinar. As a reminder, the slide presentation used for this webinar is also in the attachments tab. And for the questions that we are not able to answer as we are running over, we'll send a response via email to attendees. Philip, do you have any final comments for today?
Just I'm leaving everybody with the money slide, which again is I think is really where digital twins is going to have a lot of success. If it looks at there's a number of startups in the sentiment, emotion, well-being space, and then if you look at data governance and privacy, and if you bring those two things together into an IoT based, hardware sensor based infrastructure, I think you're really going to have a successful implementation that's going to be very appealing to cities.
Wonderful. Philip, thank you for your participation, the engaging presentation, and to all of our audience members, thank you once again for attending. If you are interested in membership and benefits of Digital Twin Consortium, you can learn more at digitaltwinconsortium.org. Have a wonderful day.